The day my own mother handed my sister the keys to the family business, while I was sitting right there at the table, was the day I made a silent, iron promise to myself. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just nodded, picked up my purse, and walked out of that house for the very last time. But not before I heard my sister laugh. That laugh. I can still hear it. And I want you to know, she is not laughing anymore. My name is Claire. And this is the story of how the people who humiliated me, dismissed me, and left me with nothing, ended up with nothing themselves. Not because I destroyed them, but because I refused to stay small. And the universe has a very, very long memory. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand why what happened matters, you have to understand where I came from. And you have to understand just how thoroughly, deliberately, and cruelly I was set up to fail. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where your family name follows you everywhere, and where appearances are everything. My parents, Richard and Donna Hartwell, owned a modest but thriving home decor and furniture store called Hartwell Home. My father had built it from nothing, literally nothing. He started by refinishing old furniture in our garage and selling pieces at flea markets on weekends. By the time I was born, Hartwell Home had its own storefront. By the time I was 12, it had 2 locations. We weren't rich, but we were respected. And in a small town, respect is its own kind of currency. There were 3 of us kids. Me, Claire, the oldest. My brother Danny, the middle child, the peacekeeper, the one who could never quite find his footing but who had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. And then there was Renee, the youngest. My sister Renee, who came into this world 7 years after me and immediately, effortlessly, became the center of it. I want to be fair. I want to be honest. Because this story isn't about jealousy. This story is about something much more calculated than that. Renee was beautiful. That's just the truth. She had our mother's dark hair and our father's green eyes, and she knew, even as a small child, exactly how to use both. She was charming in the way that certain people are charming, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room when they look at you. Teachers loved her. Neighbors loved her. Our parents, well, our parents adored her in a way that was different from how they loved Danny and me. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. But when you're growing up inside something, you don't always see its shape until you're standing outside of it. I was the responsible one. I got good grades without being told to. I helped in the store on weekends and summers without complaining. I was quiet and capable, and I handled things. And here's the thing about being the capable one in a family: they rely on you, yes. They depend on you, absolutely. But they don't always see you. Because capable people don't demand to be seen. And families, especially complicated ones, tend to give their attention to whoever is making the most noise. Renee made noise. She was dramatic and spontaneous and magnetic. And I was steady and reliable and forgettable. I wish I could tell you I figured all of this out early enough to protect myself. But I didn't. Not yet. When I was 17 and applying to colleges, I had a plan. I wanted to study business management. I wanted to eventually come back and help my father grow Hartwell Home. I had actually put together a whole notebook, this thick, messy, spiral-bound notebook full of ideas. New inventory systems. Marketing strategies. An online store, which was still a novel concept back then. My father had looked at it, nodded slowly, and said, "That's my girl. That's the Hartwell way." That was one of the best moments of my life. I got into Ohio State. Full ride, academic scholarship. I was the first person in my family to get a scholarship to a 4-year university. My parents were proud. At least, I thought they were. And that's when things started to shift in ways I was too young and too trusting to read correctly. Because that same year, Renee, who was 10 and absolutely not in need of more attention, started developing what my mother called a real gift for design. My mother began taking her to trade shows. Started letting her weigh in on store decisions. Started saying things at dinner like, "Renee has such an instinct for this business. She just feels it, you know?" I didn't say anything. I was 17. I was leaving for college. I told myself it didn't matter. But it mattered. I just didn't know it yet. College was transformative for me. I threw myself into my studies. I made real friends for the first time, people who knew nothing about my family dynamics, nothing about Hartwell Home, nothing about the version of me that had been quietly shrinking her whole life. I could just be Claire. And Claire, it turned out, was really, really good at things. I graduated with honors. I had internship experience at a retail consulting firm in Columbus. I had built genuine skills, financial analysis, supply chain management, digital marketing, team leadership. I came home at 22 years old with a head full of ideas and a heart full of hope. And I walked straight into the first wall. My father's health had been declining. He'd been diagnosed with early Parkinson's during my junior year, and while he'd managed to keep working, the disease had progressed faster than anyone expected. By the time I graduated, he was struggling. He needed help. And I was ready to give it. I spent the summer working in the store every single day. I revamped the inventory system. I launched a basic website, nothing fancy, but functional, and it immediately started generating online sales. I renegotiated 2 supplier contracts and saved the business over $12,000 in the first 3 months. $12,000. I was 22 years old. My father noticed. He squeezed my hand one evening as we were closing up the store together and said, "Claire, I don't know what I'd do without you." And I believed him. I believed that what I was building mattered. That I was seen. But that wasn't the whole picture. Because while I was quietly doing the real work, Renee, now 17, was doing something else entirely. She was being groomed. Not in a sinister way. Not consciously, maybe. But my mother had spent 7 years building a story in her own mind, a story in which Renee was the natural heir to Hartwell Home. Renee had the vision. Renee had the passion. Renee was a born entrepreneur. And my mother, bless her soul, was a woman who believed deeply in the stories she told herself. I started noticing small things. The way my mother would ask Renee's opinion on new product lines but not mine. The way she'd invite Renee into conversations with vendors, conversations I had initiated. The way she'd describe Renee to family friends as our little business prodigy while describing me as our steady Claire. She handles all the logistics. Logistics. Like I was a shipping clerk. But I kept my head down. I kept working. Because I genuinely believed that results would speak for themselves. That the numbers, the growth, the undeniable impact I was having on the business, that would be the thing that mattered in the end. I was so wrong. And I didn't see it coming. My father passed away 3 weeks before my 25th birthday. It was expected, and still completely devastating. He had been the gravitational center of our family, the person who, whatever his flaws, had always maintained a baseline of fairness. Without him, everything began to tilt. The grief was enormous. But I kept showing up. I kept running the store operations. I coordinated the funeral, handled the estate paperwork, managed the employee schedules, kept the business open through it all. Because that's what I did. I handled things. Danny was a mess. He'd never quite dealt with his feelings well and the loss nearly broke him. He ended up taking a leave of absence from his job and spending a lot of time at home, which I understood. I didn't judge him. I just quietly picked up more slack. Renee cried beautifully at the funeral. She wore black in a way that made people stop and look at her. She was surrounded by family friends murmuring about how hard this must be for her, how sensitive she was, how she and her father had such a special bond. And maybe they had. I'm not saying they didn't. But what I remember from that funeral is this: my father's 3 business partners came up to me, one by one, and told me how much they respected what I'd done for Hartwell Home. One of them, a man named Gerald who'd known my father for 30 years, pulled me aside and said, "Richard always said you were the one who'd carry this forward, Claire." He told me that himself. I held on to those words. I shouldn't have had to hold on to second-hand compliments as evidence of my own worth. But I did. Because what came next made me need them. 6 weeks after the funeral, my mother called a family meeting. I want you to hold that moment in your mind. 6 weeks. The man was barely in the ground. We sat around the kitchen table, me, Danny, Renee, my mother, and my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, who had driven in from Indiana and who had always had a soft spot for Renee. I thought this was going to be a conversation about the estate, about plans for the business, about how we'd move forward as a family. I had actually prepared. I had a folder with me, business projections, a growth plan, a staffing proposal. I was ready to lead. My mother set a manila envelope on the table. She looked at each of us. And then she started talking. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking since Dad passed. She said he'd left some verbal guidance about his wishes, nothing formalized, nothing in writing, just conversations they'd had. She said she believed, with her whole heart, that what was best for the business and for the family was to transition formal ownership of Hartwell Home to Renee. I thought I'd misheard her. She kept talking. She said that Renee had the creative spirit the business needed to evolve. She said that I, with my skills, would always be able to find opportunities and that I was so capable that she wasn't worried about me. She said Danny would receive a cash buyout from the estate, modest, but something. She said she hoped we could all be supportive of this transition. And then she slid a key across the table toward Renee. The key to the store. And Renee, my 20-year-old sister who had spent 3 months working in the store that I had spent 3 years rebuilding, picked up that key, and smiled at me, and said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I really am. But you'll land on your feet. You always do." And then she laughed. Just a small laugh. A tiny, dismissive, triumphant exhale of laughter. But I heard it. And every single person at that table heard it. Danny stared at the table. He didn't say a word. I think he was ashamed. I think he knew. Aunt Patricia nodded like this was all very reasonable. And I sat there in that chair, in that kitchen that I had grown up in the house where I had quietly and faithfully and tirelessly given everything I had to the family and to the business my father had built, and I felt something happen inside me. Not breaking. Not shattering. Something harder than that. Something closing. I stood up. I picked up my folder. I put my chair back precisely where it had been. I looked at my mother and I said, very calmly, "I understand." And then I looked at Renee and I said, "Good luck." And I walked out the door. No tears. Not until I was in my car. And even then, I didn't sob. I just let them fall, quietly, while I drove. And somewhere on that drive, between my parents' house and my apartment across town, I made the promise. The silent, iron promise. I was not going to fight for what should have been mine. I was not going to beg, or argue, or make scenes, or spend the next 10 years of my life locked in family warfare. I was going to do something much more powerful than that. I was going to become undeniable. And then I was going to let them come to me. Now, I want to be honest with you about what came next. Because it wasn't a movie montage. It wasn't smooth or triumphant or cinematic in real time. What came next was 3 of the hardest years of my life. I had some savings. Not a lot. I had my education and my experience and my skills. I had a burning, clarifying, diamond-cold motivation. And I had absolutely nothing to lose. Within a month of leaving Hartwell Home, I had taken a position as a retail operations consultant with a small firm in Columbus. It wasn't glamorous. I was the youngest person in the office by about a decade. I was making decent money but not great money. I was starting completely over. And Renee, back home, was being celebrated. I heard about it through Danny, who called occasionally and always sounded guilty. My mother had thrown Renee a party to celebrate her taking the helm of Hartwell Home. The local newspaper, yes, a literal newspaper feature, had run a story about the youngest owner in the store's history. There was a photo of Renee smiling behind the counter, her dark hair perfect, my father's name on the sign above her head. People from town reached out to me. Not to check on me. To express how excited they were for Renee. How fresh and vibrant her vision was. How she was really going to shake things up. I read every single message and responded politely and said nothing. Because here's what I understood, in a way Renee and my mother never could, attention is not the same as foundation. And celebration is not the same as competence. I wish I could say I was this perfectly composed, perfectly strategic person throughout all of it. But there were nights, hard, long nights, when I sat in my small Columbus apartment and felt the weight of everything. The injustice. The loneliness. The exhaustion of starting over. There was one Tuesday night when I sat on my kitchen floor and cried for 2 hours. Just cried. Let it all out. And then I got up. Washed my face. Made a cup of tea. Opened my laptop. And kept going. Because the other thing I understood was this: falling apart in private is allowed. It's actually necessary. But it cannot be the thing that defines you. You have to get up. So I got up. Every single time. And slowly, surely, the tide began to turn. Within 8 months at the consulting firm, I had been promoted. Within a year, I was leading my own client accounts. Within 18 months, I had saved enough money to start thinking about something bigger. And that's when the idea came to me. What if I didn't just rebuild? What if I built something they couldn't ignore? I had spent 3 years at Hartwell Home watching my father's business operate with outdated systems, limited reach, and enormous untapped potential. I knew the furniture and home decor market intimately. I knew the gaps. I knew exactly what a modern, well-run version of that business could look like. So I built it. I started working on a business plan in the evenings and on weekends. I consulted with a small business attorney. I found a business partner, a woman named Sasha, who I'd met through a professional network, who had a background in interior design and a brilliant eye for product curation. We were complete opposites in personality, which turned out to be exactly right. She was bold and expressive. I was precise and strategic. Together, we were formidable. We called the company Hartwood & Company. A deliberate echo. A subtle, private tribute to my father. And a quiet, private signal that I had not forgotten where I came from. We opened our first location, a small but beautifully designed showroom in a trendy neighborhood in Columbus, 26 months after I walked out of my family's kitchen. I put everything I had into it. Every dollar of savings. Every hour of time. Every piece of knowledge I'd accumulated. And something extraordinary happened. It worked. Not immediately. Not without 100 small disasters and panic attacks and moments of pure terror. But it worked. The store was noticed. A local lifestyle blog wrote about us. Then a Columbus magazine. Then a regional feature. Sasha's design aesthetic and my operational precision created something genuinely different, a shopping experience that felt elevated and personal and intelligent. We had a waiting list for custom pieces within 6 months. We opened our online store and it exploded in a way that felt almost surreal. Within 2 years, Hartwood & Co. had 3 locations. Within 3 years, we were doing $8 million in annual revenue. By year 4, we were being approached by a regional lifestyle brand about a potential partnership deal worth. I'll tell you the number later, because that's the part that really matters to this story. But here's what was happening back home while all of this was unfolding. Renee was struggling. I didn't gloat about this. I didn't celebrate it. Honestly, there was a part of me that still loved my sister, the complicated, bruised, complicated love that you have for someone who has hurt you deeply but who you grew up with, who you shared a childhood with, who was once a little girl you walked to the school bus. I didn't want her to fail. But I also wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening. Danny told me pieces of it over the phone. My mother's old friends would occasionally reach out, awkwardly, fishing for information that I didn't give them. And there were business circles, small world, home decor is a small world, where I simply heard things. Renee had made several costly mistakes in the first year. She'd alienated two of the store's oldest vendor relationships by trying to renegotiate contracts she didn't fully understand. She'd hired her boyfriend to manage the finances, a decision so catastrophically unwise that I can barely write it without wincing. She'd taken out a business loan to renovate the showroom, an expensive, aesthetically dramatic renovation that did not translate to increased sales. She'd fired 3 long-term employees who knew the business inside and out, replacing them with friends who had no retail experience. By the end of year 2, Hartwell Home, a business my father had built over 30 years, was in serious trouble. My mother, I later learned, had been quietly injecting personal savings to keep it afloat. Not telling Renee, just covering the gaps, too proud to admit what was happening, too deep in her own narrative to see it clearly. And Renee? Renee was still telling a story about herself. The bold young visionary. The creative entrepreneur. She was still posting about the store on social media. Still doing local speaking events for women in business. Still performing the role while the actual business quietly bled. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard all of this. But that would be a lie. I felt something. Not quite satisfaction, something more complicated than that. Something that was part grief, part vindication, and part a very old, very tired sadness that the people I came from had chosen this path when they didn't have to. But here's what I didn't know yet. The part that changed everything. They were going to ask for my help. I want you to understand what it took for that moment to arrive. Not just the years of work. Not just the business success. I mean the internal journey. Because the version of me who had sat at that kitchen table, stunned and dismissed, would not have been ready for what was coming. She would have either collapsed in gratitude or exploded in bitterness. And neither of those would have been right. I had spent 4 years, 4 hard, disciplined, clarifying years, becoming someone different. Not harder. Not colder. Actually more myself. I had built something real. I had made peace with the grief of what my family had done. I had found genuine joy in my work, in my partnership with Sasha, in the business we'd built from nothing. I had even found love, a good man named Marcus, patient and steadfast in a way I hadn't known to look for before. I had a life. A full, meaningful, genuinely satisfying life. And then, on a Thursday evening in October, my phone rang. And it was my mother. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to. Her voice was different. Smaller. The particular quality of a proud person who has been forced, by circumstances, to lay down their pride. She said she was calling because she needed to talk to me. She said things had been difficult. She said she was worried about the business. She asked if I might be willing to come home, just for a visit, just to see if maybe there was something I could offer in terms of advice. Advice. After what had been done. I breathed slowly for a moment. And then I said, "I'll think about it, Mom." She paused. I could hear the surprise. She'd expected an immediate yes. She'd expected, I think, that the moment she asked, I would rush back. That I would be so desperate for her approval, so starved for belonging, so eager to prove myself, that I would come running. I said I'd think about it. And I hung up. Sasha called me that night, after I texted her. She said, "Claire. This is the moment. Don't blow it by being either too generous or too cold. She was right. As usual. I thought about it for 3 days. I prayed. I took long walks. I talked to Marcus, who had the gift of listening without advising until you actually asked him for advice. I sat with the complexity of it all. The anger and the love and the principle and the practicality. And I decided. I would go. But I would go as who I had become. Not as who they remembered. I drove back to my hometown on a Saturday morning. 5 years and 4 months after I had walked out of that kitchen door. I drove there in a car I owned outright, wearing a coat that was quietly and deliberately expensive, with a reputation that preceded me in ways that my family was only beginning to understand. My mother met me at the door. She looked older. Tired in a way that wasn't just physical. She hugged me and I hugged her back and we both cried, a little, and I let myself feel all of it without being swept away by it. Renee was inside. That moment, walking into the living room and seeing Renee, was the moment I had thought about, in various forms, for years. I had imagined it many ways. Triumphant. Tense. Tearful. Explosive. It was none of those things. She was sitting on the couch, and she looked up when I came in, and the expression on her face was the most honest expression I had ever seen from her. No performance. No charm. Just a person who was tired and ashamed and, underneath all of it, genuinely relieved to see me. She said, "Hi, Claire." I said, "Hi, Renee." We didn't hug. My mother made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and they laid it out for me. The full picture, finally. No more story, no more performance. Just the truth. Hartwell Home was 3 months away from closing. The loan was underwater. 2 of their remaining vendors had cut credit terms. Revenue was down 40% from when I had been running operations. My mother had drained $80,000 of personal savings trying to keep it alive. Renee's boyfriend had been let go months ago, but not before the accounting was in such disarray that they'd had to hire an outside firm to untangle it, a firm that had cost them money they didn't have. My mother looked at me with eyes that held something I had never seen in them before. Regret. Real, undeniable regret. She said, "I made a mistake, Claire. I made a mistake and I think I knew it before I made it, and I made it anyway. And I'm so sorry." I had waited years to hear those words. And here's the thing about finally hearing the words you've been waiting for, they don't fix everything. They don't reach back through time and undo the hurt. But they are something. They are the beginning of something. Renee said, "I'm sorry too. I know that's not enough. I know that. But I am." I looked at both of them for a long moment. And then I said, "Tell me everything. Every number. Every vendor. Every lease term. I want to see all of it. Because here is what I had decided, in those 3 days of thinking. I was not going to rescue them. I was not going to swoop in and fix everything and hand them back the business and return to my old invisible role. That version of the story was over. But I was also not going to walk away from a business my father had built with his hands over 30 years and let it die because of a series of preventable mistakes. I was going to offer them a deal. A real, formal, legal, professional business deal. And they were going to accept it on my terms. Or not at all. I spent 2 weeks reviewing everything. I brought in my attorney. I ran the numbers 20 different ways. And then I came back to the table with a proposal. Hartwood & Co. would acquire a controlling 60% stake in Hartwell Home. We would restructure the debt, renegotiate the vendor contracts, rebuild the operations, and rebrand the store under a unified identity that would allow it to benefit from Hartwood & Co.'s existing vendor relationships and marketing reach. Renee could stay involved in a creative capacity, design curation, visual merchandising, but all financial and operational decisions would be mine. My mother would retain a small equity position and receive a monthly dividend once the business returned to profitability. The family name would be honored. The legacy would continue. In exchange, they would acknowledge, in writing, that I was the primary decision-maker. No interference. No override. Full authority. The signing of that agreement took place on a gray Tuesday morning in my attorney's office in Columbus. My mother signed it with hands that shook slightly. Renee signed it without looking up. I signed it last. And I felt my father with me in that room. I felt him like a steady hand on my shoulder. And I whispered, under my breath, so quietly that no one heard me, "I've got it, Dad." What happened over the next 18 months would have seemed impossible to the 22-year-old who had once driven home with tearful hope and a folder full of plans. Hartwell Homes' revenue doubled. We cleared the debt within 10 months. We redesigned the space. Renee's instinct for aesthetics was actually genuine. It just needed proper structure and support. We relaunched with a new brand identity that honored the original name while giving it a modern resonance. A regional lifestyle magazine ran a profile on us. The headline was, "The Hartwell Comeback: How One Woman Rebuilt a Legacy." The one woman was me. My photo was on the cover. In the article, my mother was quoted. She said, "Claire always knew what this business needed. We just didn't listen soon enough. I'm grateful she came back." That sentence. Printed. On a magazine. In the town where everyone knew everyone. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't something deeply satisfying about that. Danny called me when the article came out. He was crying. He said, "You deserved this years ago. You deserved all of it years ago." I'm sorry I sat at that table and said nothing. And I forgave him. Genuinely, completely forgave him. Because Danny had his own battles, and silence in the face of injustice is a failure, yes, but it's a human failure. I loved him. I still do. The partnership deal I mentioned earlier, the regional brand approaching Hartwood & Co., closed during this period. The deal valued Hartwood & Co. at $42 million. $42 million. For a company I had started in a rented storefront with a business partner I'd met at a networking event, funded by savings I'd scraped together after being cut out of my family's business. I'm telling you that number not to impress you. I'm telling you that number because I want you to understand something about what happens when you refuse to let the worst thing that ever happened to you become the thing that defines you. When you take the injustice and the grief and the humiliation and you put it, not into bitterness, not into rage, but into fuel. Into a relentless, dignified, patient refusal to be small. Renee lives in our hometown. She works at Hartwell Home, now Hartwell by Hartwood, as the creative director. She is genuinely talented in that role, in a way she was never able to be when she was trying to be something she wasn't, a business owner. She is better as a collaborator than a ruler. She knows that now. We are not close. We are cordial. Respectful. There is still a distance between us that may never fully close, and I have made peace with that. My mother and I have a new relationship. Slower. More careful. More honest. She has never again made a major decision involving me without asking me first. She comes to Columbus sometimes and we go to dinner and we talk, really talk, in a way we never did when I was her capable, quiet, overlooked oldest daughter. It's not the relationship I would have chosen. But it's a real one. And real is worth something. I married Marcus. We have a daughter, Eleanor, who has her father's patience and my stubbornness and a laugh that is the best thing I have ever heard in my entire life. And sometimes, when I'm having a hard day, because hard days don't stop, they just change shape, I think about that kitchen table. That manila envelope. The key sliding across the wood. The small, dismissive laugh. And I think about what I know now, that I couldn't have known then. The moment they chose her over me was the moment they handed me the only motivation I would ever need to become everything I was supposed to be. They thought they were leaving me behind. They were launching me. They laughed at my struggle. And I used every single second of that struggle to build something they could never take from me, because I built it myself, from nothing, in the dark, when no one was watching and no one was helping and no one was clapping. And now? Now they need me. And I help them. Not out of weakness. Not out of need. Not out of the desperate, aching desire to finally be seen that I once carried everywhere like a stone in my chest. I help them out of choice. Out of strength. Out of the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I am not who they decided I was at that kitchen table. I never was. The people who underestimate you are not your enemies. They are your unintentional instructors. They are the ones who force you, by leaving you no other option, to discover just how extraordinary you actually are. You think you're writing someone off. But you're just writing the first chapter of their comeback. And the thing about a woman who has been underestimated her whole life and decided, finally, to stop proving it and just live it? She doesn't need your applause anymore. She never needed it. She just needed to know that for herself. And now she does.